A man with enough money to buy God's silence used his power to crucify his fucking maid. He framed the one person who was loyal to him for stealing a family treasure she never touched, a crime she didn't commit. Then, with the help of a corrupt piece of shit judge in his pocket, he made damn sure she was buried alive, sentenced to 15 years in a cage without a shred of real evidence, without so much as a fair trial. Everyone, from the cops to the press, swallowed the lie whole. They all believed she was guilty, until the billionaire's own 9-year-old son started to pull at the loose threads of his father's perfect story. What that little boy would uncover wasn't just a lie. It was a goddamn web of deceit so toxic it would shake the justice system to its core and change every single one of their lives forever. Before we dive headfirst into this nest of vipers, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button and obliterate the like button. Oh, and don't you dare forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love knowing who's riding along with us on this crazy journey. Arthur Sterling woke before the sun, as he always did on days when the world was expected to bend to his will. Today was one of those days. A private gala was scheduled at the Sterling estate, an intimate gathering for a cabal of investors whose wallets were as deep as their morals were shallow. Everything had to be flawless. Arthur wasn't just selling them on a new venture, he was selling them on the myth of Arthur Sterling, the history, the power, the untouchable legacy of his family name. He stalked the cavernous hallways of his Greenwich, Connecticut mansion, his eyes scanning every surface for imperfections. The gardens were manicured to within an inch of their life. The staff moved with the silent, terrified efficiency of ghosts, and the air was already thick with the aroma of a feast fit for kings. Before facing his guests, Arthur sought a moment of solitude in the heart of his empire, the family library. This room was his sanctuary, a tomb of memories filled with priceless first editions and artifacts plundered from around the globe. But its most sacred relic, his personal holy of holies, was the Star of Astoria, a diamond necklace of impossible brilliance, resting within a climate-controlled glass vitrine. It had belonged to his mother, and it symbolized every ounce of blood, sweat, and ruthlessness his family had poured into building their dynasty. He approached the vitrine, a ritual he performed before any significant event, seeking a silent blessing from the ghost of his mother. But this time, the ritual was broken. The world tilted on its axis, the vitrine was ajar, and the Star of Astoria was gone. For a heartbeat, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. He blinked, expecting the diamonds to reappear, to catch the morning sun and explode into a familiar rainbow of fire. But the velvet pedestal was bare. He scanned the room, a cold dread coiling in his gut. Perhaps it had been moved for cleaning, a security upgrade? But there was no note, no explanation. Nothing. Arthur's heart, a muscle he rarely used for anything other than pumping ice through his veins, began to hammer against his ribs. That necklace had never, not once, left its sanctuary. It was irreplaceable. He roared for his staff. Security, maids, kitchen hands, assistants. They all scrambled into the library, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. He demanded to know who had been in the library that morning. A chorus of denials. No one had seen anything. They had all been consumed with preparations for the gala. Arthur's voice dropped an octave, the velvet glove of his authority slipping off to reveal the iron fist beneath. He asked again, louder, the question laced with a menace that made the air crackle. This wasn't a missing object. This was a violation, a desecration. After a brutal interrogation of several staff members, a single name emerged. Only one person had been granted access to the library that morning. Isabella Rossi, the head housekeeper. She had gone in to perform her daily duties, dusting the furniture, polishing the floors, ensuring the tomb remained pristine. Arthur summoned her. Isabella appeared, her brow furrowed with a nervous confusion. She had worked for the Sterling family for nearly a decade, a model of quiet loyalty and impeccable service. She had never been so much as reprimanded. When Arthur confronted her, his voice a low growl, asking her directly about the necklace, her eyes widened in genuine shock. She insisted she hadn't even looked at the vitrine, that she never touched anything but the surfaces she was meant to clean. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. She would never steal from the family that had provided for her and her son. She tried to offer an explanation, to help him think, but Arthur was no longer listening. His grief, a raw and festering wound from his mother's long-ago death, had metastasized into pure, undiluted rage. He saw only betrayal. He had placed his trust in this woman, and in his mind, she had spat on it. He didn't want an investigation. He didn't want a process. He wanted a sacrifice. In that moment, he made a decision as swift and final as a guillotine's blade. He accused Isabella Rossi of stealing the Star of Astoria. He painted a picture of a greedy, opportunistic servant who thought she could snatch a priceless treasure and vanish without a trace. Isabella's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to plead, but Arthur cut her off with a vicious slice of his hand. He was too consumed by his own pain to hear hers. He spat that she had stolen something that could never be replaced, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented. The necklace was his last tangible link to his mother, to the ghost of his childhood, to the long, quiet conversations they'd had in this very room about the future of the Sterling Empire. He felt as if Isabella had not just stolen a jewel, but had ripped out his heart and stomped on it. The other staff members stood frozen, a silent chorus of fear. Not a single soul dared to speak in her defense. Arthur Sterling was their god, and when their god was wrathful, you did not question his judgment. Isabella was ordered out of the house, immediately. A guard was summoned to escort her from the property as if she were a common criminal. She walked out in a state of shock, her mind struggling to catch up with the nightmare that had just consumed her life. She cast one last, disbelieving look at the mansion before the massive iron gates slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. There had been no proof, no questions, no chance to speak. Her job, her home, her reputation, her very identity, all extinguished in a matter of minutes. Arthur, still shaking with fury, ordered his security chief to call the police. He wanted a full report filed, an investigation launched, but it was all for show. He had already passed his sentence. He also demanded the installation of more security cameras, despite the estate already being a fortress. He trusted no one anymore. In his mind, the betrayal was absolute. Isabella was guilty, and he would move heaven and earth to see her punished. He felt alone, enraged, and more fiercely protective of his legacy than ever before. As the day bled into evening, the guests began to arrive, blissfully unaware of the brutal drama that had unfolded just hours earlier. Arthur plastered a mask of civility onto his face and played the part of the gracious host. He delivered speeches, shook hands, and spoke of billion-dollar futures. But his mind was a storm, constantly returning to the empty vitrine in the library. That vacant space felt like a black hole in the center of his universe. Isabella was gone, but the necklace was still missing. The problem wasn't solved, it had just begun. Amid the clinking of champagne glasses and the murmur of polite conversation, a poison had been released into the foundations of the house. At the end of the night, long after the last guest had departed, Arthur stood before the empty display case, a solitary figure engulfed by shadows. He felt a toxic cocktail of pride, anger, and a profound, bottomless sadness. The tragedy had been set in motion, though no one, least of all him, could possibly comprehend how far its devastation would reach. After the explosion over the missing necklace, Arthur Sterling did not hesitate. He was a man who commanded results, and he wanted them now. He leveraged his immense wealth and a web of contacts that reached into the darkest corners of the justice system. A few phone calls were all it took. One of those calls was to Judge Wallace Thorne, a man whose career Arthur had personally bankrolled years ago. Within hours, a private trial was not just requested, it was scheduled. Arthur made it unequivocally clear to everyone involved that this was a matter of utmost urgency. He needed to cauterize the wound, to make an example of Isabella, to send a chilling message that to cross him was to be erased. Arthur informed the authorities that Isabella had shattered his trust and defiled his family's honor. He didn't give a damn that there was no investigation, no evidence, no due process. His pride had been wounded, and that was evidence enough for him. The gears of a corrupt system began to turn, lubricated by his money and influence. Everyone in his orbit felt the immense pressure to comply. No one was stupid enough to challenge Arthur Sterling. Isabella was arrested before she had a chance to even process the accusation. She was a single mother with no savings, no powerful friends, and no idea how to navigate the legal labyrinth she'd been thrown into. In a dizzying blur of days, she found herself standing in a courtroom, terrified and utterly alone. The air was thick with prejudice. The faces around her were cold and dismissive. There was no one there to fight for her, to speak for her rights. A court-appointed public defender met her for 5 minutes before the proceedings began. He barely made eye contact and seemed more interested in his lunch plans. She tried to tell her story, to explain that she never touched the necklace, but her words were swallowed by the cavernous, indifferent room. It was painfully clear that the verdict had been written long before the trial began. Arthur sat in the front row, a portrait of calm, righteous fury, watching his personal play unfold exactly as he had directed. Isabella felt herself shrink, becoming infinitesimally small, a powerless pawn in a rich man's cruel game. Judge Wallace Thorne swept into the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him like a dark omen. He carried himself with an air of gravitas, but his frequent familiar glances toward Arthur betrayed their true relationship. This wasn't a trial, it was a private agreement being formally ratified. When Arthur spoke, his voice boomed with confidence and conviction. He painted Isabella as a serpent he had foolishly welcomed into his home, a once loyal servant who had succumbed to greed. He spoke emotionally about the necklace, weaving a tale of its sacred connection to his sainted mother. Despite the utter lack of forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no security footage, no witnesses, Arthur's narrative was treated as gospel. The few half-hearted attempts by the public defender to point out inconsistencies were swiftly overruled by Judge Thorne. It was a perfectly choreographed performance of injustice. Isabella stood in silence, the horrifying realization dawning on her that in this room, the truth was irrelevant. After a comically short recess, the judge returned and read the verdict. Guilty of grand larceny. The sentence was a death blow. 15 years. A gasp escaped Isabella's lips. She tried to speak, to scream, but the guards were already moving toward her, their faces impassive. Tears streamed down her face as she scanned the room. A desperate, silent plea for someone, anyone, to stop this madness. But the spectators were either too cowed or too complicit to intervene. Arthur's face remained a stone mask. For him, the matter was closed. His family's honor was restored. The message sent. The courtroom fell silent, but it wasn't the silence of justice served. It was the suffocating silence of a grave being filled. As Isabella was led away, her life in ruins, not everyone was convinced. In a back row, almost hidden from view, sat Arthur's 9-year-old son, Leo. Brought along by his nanny, he was considered little more than a piece of furniture. But he had been watching and listening. He remembered Isabella. She wasn't a serpent. She was the one who always saved him the last chocolate chip cookie, who helped him find his favorite toy soldier when it went missing. She was one of the only people in that cold, sterile mansion who ever spoke to him with genuine warmth. As he watched her being dragged away, sobbing, a strange knot tightened in his stomach. This was wrong. All of it. He had never seen his father look so cold, so inhuman. The way the judge and the lawyers had avoided asking real questions gnawed at him. He couldn't articulate it, but he sensed a deep, unspoken lie at the heart of the day's events. Leo said nothing on the drive home, but a quiet vow took root in his young mind. He would find the truth. While his father and the rest of the household moved on, eager to forget the unpleasantness, Leo couldn't forget. He couldn't shake the image of Isabella's eyes, wide with terror and disbelief. He kept replaying the trial in his head, the words that were said and, more importantly, the words that weren't. His father's absolute control didn't feel like justice. It felt like tyranny. Isabella's tears didn't look like the tears of a guilty woman. They looked like the tears of a shattered soul. And so, while no one was watching, the smallest member of the Sterling family quietly became a detective. The first days in prison were a descent into hell for Isabella. The iron doors clanged shut, and with them, the world she knew ceased to exist. She was adrift in a sea of despair, the hours bleeding into one another in a gray, featureless fog. But even in the depths of her brokenness, a tiny, resilient spark refused to be extinguished. She was innocent, and she would not let Arthur Sterling's lie be the final word on her life. Alone in the suffocating silence of her cell, her thoughts drifted back to a life before the Sterlings, to a childhood friendship that had once been her anchor. She remembered Anya Sharma. They had been inseparable as kids, two bright, inquisitive souls against the world. Anya had grown up to become a brilliant forensic scientist, a legend in her field who had helped crack some of the most complex cases before retiring early to live a quiet life. Isabella hadn't spoken to her in years, but Anya was now her only glimmer of hope. She wrote a desperate, heartfelt letter from the prison library and prayed it would find her. Weeks later, a miracle. She was granted a supervised visit. The destination, a small, secluded cottage nestled in the woods far from the city. When Anya opened the door, her warm smile faltered. The Isabella standing before her was a ghost of the vibrant woman she remembered, gaunt, haunted, with eyes that held the weight of a terrible injustice. They embraced, and the dam of Isabella's composure finally broke. Inside, surrounded by the comforting clutter of books and scientific equipment, Isabella poured out the whole sordid story. The missing necklace, the kangaroo court, the monstrous 15-year sentence. She swore on her son's life that she had never even laid a finger on the Star of Astoria. Anya listened with the focused intensity of a seasoned investigator, her sharp mind dissecting every detail. Then, Isabella mentioned something she'd almost forgotten. A small, seemingly insignificant detail. A pristine white linen cloth was always kept draped over the glass vitrine to protect it from dust. On the morning of the alleged theft, that cloth was gone. That detail snagged Anya's attention. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Tell me more about this cloth." Isabella recounted how the cloth had been in its place the day before. The morning the necklace was discovered missing, the cloth had vanished as well. Anya's mind began to race, forming a hypothesis. If the real thief had used the cloth to handle the necklace, perhaps to avoid leaving fingerprints, and if they were panicked or clumsy, they might have injured themselves. A tiny snag on the necklace's clasp, a sharp edge on the vitrine. It could have drawn a single drop of blood, left behind skin cells. That cloth could hold the key. It could contain DNA evidence. Even if the police had closed the case, if they could find that cloth, Anya could run the tests herself. She still had contacts and access to a private lab. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope ignited in Isabella's eyes. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but it was real. It was something tangible to fight with. What neither woman knew was that they were not alone. Outside, concealed by the dense foliage, a small figure was watching. It was Leo. He had been tracking Isabella's case with a secret, obsessive focus. When he overheard a guard mentioning her supervised release, a risky idea had formed in his mind. He had to know more. He had secretly followed the transport vehicle. When he saw her enter Anya's cottage, he crept closer. The window was cracked open just enough for him to hear snippets of their conversation. He heard Isabella's desperate pleas of innocence. And then he heard them talk about the cloth. The words, white cloth, echoed in his mind. A memory, fuzzy at first, began to sharpen. He had seen that cloth. Not just in the library, but somewhere else. Somewhere it didn't belong. He couldn't place it yet, but he knew it was important. He pressed his ear closer to the window as Anya explained the science of DNA, how it could definitively prove someone else had handled the necklace. The first step, they agreed, was a desperate one. Find the cloth. Outside, Leo backed away slowly, his heart pounding. His suspicions had just solidified into near certainty. Isabella didn't sound like a liar. She sounded like a victim, and the story about the cloth made perfect, terrifying sense. He replayed the days surrounding the theft in his mind, searching for that misplaced memory. He remembered wandering the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, bored. He'd passed the secondary laundry room on the 3rd floor, a place rarely used. And that's when it hit him like a lightning bolt. The cloth. He had seen it, stuffed in a corner hamper behind the old steam press, a place the regular staff never touched. At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. Now, it was everything. He looked back at the cottage one last time before melting back into the woods. He now possessed a secret that could shatter his family, and he knew exactly where the proof was hidden. Leo returned to the mansion, his small body buzzing with a nervous energy he could barely contain. His heart thudded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The conversation he'd overheard at Anya's cottage echoed in his mind. He had to be careful. One wrong move, one suspicious glance from his father, and it would all be over. He slipped in through a side entrance, unnoticed. The staff were like busy ants, and his father was likely cloistered in his office, orchestrating the movements of his vast empire. His feet carried him, as if on their own, toward that office. The room was forbidden territory, but he'd been inside enough times to know its secrets. He pushed the heavy oak door open a crack and slipped inside. The air was still and smelled of old leather and his father's expensive cologne. He remembered something from the days after Isabella was taken away. His father, in a fit of paranoia, had collected all the cleaning supplies from the library, claiming they were now part of a crime scene. They'd been stored in a small wooden cabinet in the corner of his office, a place no one would think to look. Holding his breath, Leo moved some files aside and pulled open the lower compartment door. And there it was. Folded neatly, almost mockingly, was the white linen cloth. He lifted it with trembling hands. It was just as Isabella had described, and on its surface, almost invisible against the white, was a small, dark red stain. It was dried and crusty. It could have been anything, a drop of wine, a speck of food. But as Leo looked closer, a horrifying memory slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. A few days before the necklace went missing, he'd been playing with his soldiers in the upstairs hallway when he saw his older sister, Victoria. She was 17 and always moved with a frantic, nervous energy. That day she had hurried past him, glancing over her shoulder as if being followed. In her hands she clutched something small, wrapped in a white cloth. She'd shot him a panicked look but said nothing as she rushed into her room and slammed the door. He hadn't thought anything of it then, but now, standing in his father's silent office, holding what he knew was the very same cloth, it all clicked into place. The stain wasn't wine, it was blood. Leo didn't know the exact sequence of events, but the truth was now brutally clear. Isabella was innocent. His sister had taken the necklace. The cloth, with its damning speck of evidence, proved it. She must have cut herself while taking it from the vitrine, maybe on the sharp edge of the glass or the prongs of the setting. Fear, confusion, and a hot surge of anger washed over him. But above all, he felt an urgent, crushing need to act. He couldn't leave this here. He carefully folded the cloth, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and put everything back exactly as he'd found it. He had to get this to Anya. She would know what to do. She could prove the blood wasn't Isabella's. It was an enormous risk. He was just a boy, and his father was a king. If Arthur found out, his rage would be biblical. But Leo didn't care. The image of Isabella's crying face was seared into his memory. She didn't deserve to rot in a cage for a crime she didn't commit. She had shown him more kindness than almost anyone in his own family. He couldn't live with himself knowing he had the key to her freedom, and did nothing. A plan began to form in his mind. He would leave at dawn the next morning, before anyone was awake. He'd take a taxi to Anya's cottage. He had enough money saved up from his birthdays. That night was agony. He hid the cloth under his mattress, tucked away behind a stack of comic books. At the dinner table, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria was silent, picking at her food, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Arthur pontificated about business deals and market fluctuations, oblivious to the drama unfolding under his own roof. Leo sat in silence, pretending to listen, while his mind raced. He watched his sister. She seemed coiled as tight as a spring, ready to snap. He noticed a small, fresh bandage on her right index finger, which she kept trying to hide under the table. It was all the confirmation he needed. After dinner, he went straight to his room, his heart a frantic drum. He had no idea what the next day would bring, but he knew he was about to start a war. The next morning, in the pre-dawn gray, Leo dressed silently. He grabbed the cloth, pulled on his jacket, and crept out of the mansion. He didn't leave a note. He just walked, a small soldier on a mission of immense consequence, the fate of at least 2 lives held in the palm of his hand. He hailed a taxi on the main road and gave the driver Anya's address. During the ride, he clutched the cloth in his pocket, a sacred relic. He didn't look at the passing scenery. He just stared straight ahead, focusing on what he had to do. When the taxi arrived, he paid the driver and marched up to the cottage door. He knocked. A moment later, Anya opened it, her face a mask of surprise at the sight of the small, determined boy on her doorstep. Without a word, Leo pulled the cloth from his pocket. "I think this will help," he said, his voice small but steady. He felt a tremor of fear, but he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he had just done the right thing. He handed it to her, and in a rush of words, explained everything. Finding it in his father's office, the memory of his sister, his certainty that the stain was blood. Anya listened, her expression shifting from surprise to a deep, profound respect. She took the cloth gently, as if it were the most precious object in the world, and laid it on her work table. "You have done a very brave thing, Leo," she told him. She promised him absolute secrecy, She explained she had a trusted contact at a private forensic lab. She would send the sample out for testing, making sure there was no paper trail, nothing that could lead back to him. Leo nodded, the weight on his shoulders beginning to ease, replaced by a new, heavier sense of anticipation. Later that day, Anya carefully packaged the cloth and sent it via a secure courier to her old colleague, with a note containing only technical instructions. The sender's name was an alias. Back at the Sterling estate, Leo slipped back into his life, a ghost in his own home. His father barely registered his comings and goings, attributing his son's quiet, distracted nature to the recent household unpleasantness. Arthur assumed the boy would simply get over it. He had no idea that the foundation of his world had been fractured, that his own son no longer saw him as a father, but as a liar and a bully. Meanwhile, Victoria's behavior grew more erratic. She became a recluse in her own home, her guilt a palpable presence in every room she entered. Whenever Isabella's name was mentioned on the news, she would flinch or abruptly leave the room. Leo observed it all, a silent, watchful judge. He felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to believe his own sister could be responsible and that his father was either complicit or willfully blind. The pressure was immense. He wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops, but he knew he had to wait. Anya had told him to be patient, but patience was a form of torture. The news was relentless. Isabella's face was plastered across tabloids and television screens, branded a thief, a viper. Oliver felt a sickening rage every time he saw it. He knew the truth. And the adults, the powerful ones who were supposed to be wise and fair, were all wrong. It was a brutal lesson for a 9-year-old to learn. Adults could be monsters, and sometimes those monsters were your own family. The days crawled by. Each passing hour felt like a year as he waited for Anya's call. He jumped every time his phone buzzed. He fantasized about the results coming back, about marching into his father's office and revealing the truth. What would happen then? Would his father admit he was wrong? Or would he try to bury this lie, too? As he waited, a new resolve hardened within him. If the DNA results proved Isabella's innocence, he wouldn't just give them to Anya. He would make them public. He would expose the whole rotten system his father had manipulated. He didn't know how yet. A video, a letter to a newspaper. But he knew he would not be silent. He would not let his sister hide. He would not let his father win. Even if it meant destroying his own family, he would fight for what was right. All he needed was the proof. And he knew it was coming. At the Sterling estate, Arthur began to sense a shift in the atmosphere. The triumphant silence that had followed Isabella's conviction had been replaced by something else. Something uneasy. He noticed the subtle signs. Hushed whispers among the staff that ceased the moment he entered a room. Victoria's increasingly reclusive behavior. One afternoon, he was passing the sunroom when he heard his daughter's voice, thin and panicked. She was on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. Arthur paused, hidden from view. "I don't know what to do," she hissed into the receiver. "What if they find it? What if they find out about the cloth?" Arthur froze. Cloth. The word hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't thought about the linen cloth from the vitrine since the trial. Hearing the word from his daughter's lips sent a spike of ice through his veins. He backed away silently before she could see him, his mind reeling. At the same time, just on the other side of the sunroom door, Leo sat on the floor, pretending to read a book. He had been shadowing his sister for days. He heard every word. His hand flew to the small notebook he now carried everywhere, hidden in his pocket. He scribbled down her exact words, the date, the time. He had to be methodical. This was evidence. While he was documenting his sister's panicked words, another unexpected event unfolded. A man appeared at the front gate. Not a business associate or a society friend, but an investigative journalist from a major news network. He said he was doing a follow-up piece on the Sterling thief case and had some questions about the rushed nature of the trial. The butler attempted to send him away, but Arthur, unnerved by what he'd just heard from Victoria, decided to face him. The journalist was polite but firm, asking about the lack of physical evidence and the known personal connection between Arthur and Judge Thorne. Arthur gave clipped, dismissive answers, but he could feel the narrative slipping from his control. The world was starting to look closer. That evening, Leo knew he couldn't wait any longer. He called Anya and arranged to meet. In the twilight of her garden, safe from prying eyes, he showed her his notebook, detailing Victoria's phone call. Anya listened, her face grim. Then she opened a file she'd brought with her. The lab results were back. She looked Leo directly in the eye, her voice steady and clear. The DNA from the bloodstain on the cloth belonged to a female. "And Leo," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "it's not Isabella Rossi's." Leo stared at the printed report. The scientific jargon was indecipherable, but the conclusion was a trumpet blast of truth. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a fact. The blood was not Isabella's, and based on everything he had seen and heard, there was only one other person it could be. Victoria. The public was already starting to question the verdict. Now they had the weapon that could blow the case wide open. Anya looked at him. "We're running out of time, Leo." In that moment, any remaining fear Leo felt was burned away by a cold, hard resolve. He had to act. He couldn't let his father bury this. He asked Anya to help him. The media pressure had forced the court to grant Isabella an appeal, a retrial. Leo would not be a spectator this time. He would be a witness. In the frantic days leading up to the retrial, Leo and Anya worked tirelessly. They prepared the DNA report, established an airtight chain of custody for the evidence, and organized Leo's meticulous notes into a clear timeline. Anya hired a new bulldog of a lawyer for Isabella, a woman who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. At the mansion, Arthur was coming undone. He was short-tempered and paranoid. He yelled at Victoria one morning, demanding to know what she had meant about a cloth, but she just dissolved into hysterical tears and locked herself in her room. The guilt was consuming her. Leo watched them both, a silent observer in a house built on lies. He spent every spare moment rehearsing his testimony, preparing for the questions he would be asked. Anya warned him it would be brutal, that his father's lawyers would try to tear him apart. Leo didn't care. The truth was his shield and his sword. Finally, the day of the retrial came. The courthouse was a media circus. Reporters swarmed the entrance, and protesters held signs demanding justice for Isabella. Inside, Isabella sat beside her new lawyer, looking exhausted but with a fragile spark of hope in her eyes. Leo entered the courtroom with Anya, clutching the file containing the DNA report and his notebook. Arthur was already there, seated in the front row. He turned and saw his son, and his face registered a flicker of shock and something else. Fear. For a long moment, their eyes locked across the crowded room. Leo did not look away. He knew his father was afraid of the truth he was about to unleash. As the judge entered and the court was called to order, Leo felt his heart pound, not with fear, but with a powerful, surging sense of purpose. The war had begun. The day of the hearing dawned, thick with anticipation. The courthouse was a fortress under siege by the media. The public pressure, fueled by the investigative journalist's initial story, had become a tidal wave, forcing the system to re-examine a case it had been so eager to bury. This time, Leo was not a frightened child in the back row. He was a key player. He stood on the courthouse steps with Anya, a small, resolute figure ready for battle. As they walked through the throng of reporters, they saw Arthur waiting with a team of high-priced lawyers. He projected an aura of bored indifference, the same arrogance he had worn at the first trial. He still believed his power was absolute. He shot Leo a look of pure ice, a silent command to stand down. Leo met his gaze and kept walking. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Wallace Thorne was on the bench, his face an impassive mask, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. Isabella was escorted in. She looked frail, but her eyes were clear and focused. She had a real lawyer now, one who believed in her and was armed with the truth. Arthur and his legal team took their places, whispering confidently. Arthur was convinced this was a minor inconvenience, a procedural hurdle he would easily clear. The session began, and it was immediately clear that Judge Thorne was trying to control the narrative, just as he had before. He dismissed motions from Isabella's new lawyer and sustained objections from Arthur's team. It felt like a replay of the first sham trial. A sense of despair began to creep into the room. It seemed that even with the world watching, the system was still rigged. And that's when Leo stood up. He walked calmly to the front of the courtroom, holding the folded white cloth in his hand. The room fell silent. Judge Thorne glared down at him. "Young man, this is a court of law. Return to your seat." Leo didn't move. His voice, though small, rang out with unnerving clarity. "I have evidence," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I have proof that Isabella Rossi is innocent." Before Thorne could silence him, Anya stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice commanding respect, "this boy has crucial physical evidence that was suppressed during the initial investigation." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge, for the first time, looked flustered. Leo held up the cloth for everyone to see. "This cloth was used to take the necklace," he announced, "and it has blood on it, but it's not Isabella's blood." The whispers grew louder. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Arthur's face had gone rigid. Leo handed the cloth and the official sealed lab report to the court officer. Judge Thorne stared at the documents, his composure cracking. Anya explained how a private, accredited lab had conducted the forensic analysis, proving the DNA on the cloth belonged to an unidentified female, but definitively excluding Isabella. Isabella's lawyer formally moved to have the report entered into evidence. Thorne, trapped by procedure and the glare of the public eye, had no choice but to agree. Arthur shifted in his seat, a flicker of panic in his eyes. In the back of the courtroom, Victoria seemed to shrink into herself, her face as pale as death. "I asked for the test," Leo stated, his voice unwavering, "because nobody else would." The lawyer then began her presentation, masterfully deconstructing the original case. She highlighted the complete lack of investigation, the procedural violations, and Judge Thorne's clear bias. She then dropped her final bombshell, referencing Leo's notes. She spoke of the phone call Leo had overheard, quoting Victoria directly. "What if they find out about the cloth?" At the mention of her name, Victoria let out a small, strangled sob. Judge Thorne looked as if he'd been struck. The public defender from the first trial was called and admitted, under oath, that he had been pressured to resolve the case quickly and had not provided an adequate defense. Everything was unraveling. The courtroom was no longer Arthur Sterling's private theater. It was a stage for the truth. Leo returned to his seat, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had done it. He had spoken. Anya gave him a proud, reassuring nod. Richard refused to look at his son, his face a thunderous mask of rage and disbelief. He had built an empire on his ability to control every outcome, and his own 9-year-old son had just demolished it with a piece of cloth and the simple, stubborn truth. The judge, visibly shaken, called a recess to review the new evidence. Reporters stampeded out of the room to file their breaking stories. Isabella sat at her table, tears streaming down her face, not of fear this time, but of overwhelming, unbelievable hope. The truth was finally free. The final session began in a courtroom crackling with an almost unbearable tension. The judge entered, his face grim. He announced that the lab report had been verified by the court. He cleared his throat, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. The DNA found on the evidentiary cloth has been positively matched to Miss Victoria Sterling. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Arthur's jaw went slack. He stared, unseeing, first at the judge, then at his own daughter. Victoria froze, her face a mask of pure terror. The expert witness called by Isabella's team explained that the blood pattern was consistent with a fresh cut, likely sustained while hurriedly removing the necklace from its case. The evidence was irrefutable. Anya was called to the stand and calmly, methodically, laid out the scientific facts, her testimony painting a picture of a clumsy, panicked thief. She never mentioned Victoria by name, but she didn't have to. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the terrified 17-year-old girl. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. Finally, with a choked sob, Victoria stumbled to her feet. "I wasn't trying to steal it," she cried, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to wear it, to show my friends at a party. I knew Dad would never let me." She looked at her father, her eyes pleading. "I dropped it when I was putting it back. I cut my hand on the case. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I never thought they would blame Isabella." She collapsed back into her seat, her confession hanging in the air like poison gas. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting into their phones. The story was breaking live, across the nation, across the world. A billionaire's daughter framing the maid. A child exposing the conspiracy. Arthur stood up, his face ashen, but the judge ordered him to sit. Isabella's lawyer was on her feet, demanding an immediate and full exoneration. Judge Thorne, his career in ruins, his corruption laid bare for the world to see, had no choice. "All charges against Miss Isabella Rossi are dismissed," he mumbled. The room exploded in applause. Isabella sat stunned as a guard quietly unlocked her handcuffs. Justice, late but ferocious, had finally arrived. The chaos spilled onto the courthouse steps. Richard and Victoria were swarmed by a mob of reporters shouting questions. "Why did you let an innocent woman go to prison? Did you know your daughter was the thief?" Arthur said nothing, his face a blank mask of shock as his security team bundled him and his sobbing daughter into a waiting car. Isabella emerged moments later, flanked by Anya and Leo. Her name was cleared, but the scars would remain. Leo stayed by her side, a small, silent guardian. In the back of the car, Richard stared out the window, the world a meaningless blur. He had orchestrated this entire tragedy. He had bullied the judge, silenced his staff, and refused to entertain even the possibility of Isabella's innocence. He had chosen pride over truth, and the cost was catastrophic. He glanced at Leo, who sat opposite him. The boy stared straight ahead, his expression not of anger, but of a deep, profound disappointment that cut Richard deeper than any accusation. In that moment, Richard Sterling realized he had lost something far more valuable than the Star of Astoria. He had lost his son. The courtroom was still buzzing when the judge officially closed the case. The legal battle was over, but the personal one was just beginning. Everyone expected the next step, a massive civil lawsuit. Isabella versus Sterling. She had been libeled, falsely imprisoned, her life destroyed. She had every right to demand a fortune in damages. Her lawyers were already drafting the paperwork. Then, Isabella stood. She took a deep, steadying breath and looked directly at Arthur Sterling. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, weary sadness. The room quieted. "I forgive you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Hate is a prison, and I have spent enough time in one." The entire room was stunned into silence. The judge, the lawyers, the reporters, no one moved. Isabella had just been handed the power to financially and socially ruin one of the most powerful men in the world, and she had chosen mercy. Judge Thorne stared, speechless. Even Leo looked at her with awe. Arthur remained in his seat, and for the first time in his adult life, in front of the entire world, he began to weep. Not tears of rage or self-pity, but of genuine soul-crushing remorse. He rose shakily to his feet. "I am so sorry," he choked out. He crossed the aisle to his son and pulled him into a desperate hug. Then, turning to Isabella, he whispered, "Thank you." It was a moment of such raw, unexpected humanity that even the most cynical reporters lowered their cameras. Isabella simply nodded. For her, forgiveness wasn't a performance. It was a release. She had suffered enough. She wanted to be free. Leo went to her side and took her hand. It was a simple gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. "I just want to go home," she said quietly. "No lawsuits, no revenge, just peace." In that moment, something inside Arthur Sterling broke. For decades, he had believed power was the ultimate currency, but his power had not saved him. It had damned him. It was an act of grace from the woman he had wronged that had offered him a chance at redemption. The judge, humbled and broken, entered her words into the official record and allowed her to leave. As she walked out of the courtroom, a free woman, the staff and spectators stood in a silent show of respect. The news of her forgiveness sent shockwaves through the country. Headlines read, "Maid forgives billionaire in shocking courtroom finale." Pundits debated her decision. But Isabella didn't care. She went to a small apartment Anya had arranged, turned off her phone, and for the first time in months, felt the quiet calm of freedom. Meanwhile, Arthur sat alone in his vast, silent mansion. He looked at the trappings of his success and saw only the monuments to his own failure. His daughter was facing criminal charges. His son could barely look at him. His reputation was in ashes. But beneath the rubble of his old life, something new was stirring. A genuine desire to be a better man. The next morning, he called his lawyers and instructed them to establish a multi-million-dollar fund in Isabella's name. He then called a press conference. People expected a carefully worded statement of damage control. Instead, Arthur walked to the microphone and spoke from the heart. "I am not here to ask for forgiveness," he began. "I am here to take responsibility." He announced the fund. "This is not charity," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a restitution. It is a long overdue payment on a debt of justice." He then announced he was stepping down as CEO of Sterling Industries, severing all ties with Judge Thorne, and funding an independent commission to investigate judicial misconduct. He was dismantling the very systems that had enabled his tyranny. Isabella, upon receiving the funds, did not buy a mansion or a fleet of luxury cars. Instead, she founded a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid and support to the wrongfully convicted. It would offer legal services, job training, and counseling to those who had been chewed up and spat out by the system. She named it the Leo Initiative, in honor of the boy whose courage had saved her. When she told Leo, he simply hugged her, his quiet smile saying more than words ever could. The initiative became a national success story. Volunteers flocked to help. Richard Sterling, at first, stayed away, not wanting to taint the project with his presence. But after several months, he began showing up. Not as a donor, but as an anonymous volunteer. He swept floors, served meals, and listened to the stories of the men and women his world had once crushed. Emily recognized him on the first day, but said nothing. She allowed him to find his own path to redemption in the quiet humility of service. He never asked for recognition. He was no longer the master of the universe, just a man trying to learn a new language, the language of humanity. Emily herself began teaching a class at the Institute on ethics and dignity, using her own story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a lesson in resilience. She taught that silence in the face of injustice is a choice, and that true strength is not about revenge, but about rebuilding. On the one-year anniversary of the initiative's founding, a small celebration was held. At the end of the evening, Emily asked Leo, now a thoughtful and mature 10-year-old, to say a few words. He stood before the small crowd, his face serious. "Justice isn't about being powerful," he said simply. "It's about doing what's right, especially when you're small." In the back of the room, hidden in the shadows, Richard Sterling wiped a tear from his eye. Emily stood beside Leo, her hand on his shoulder. The story wasn't over. It had just begun a new chapter, written not with power or money, but with courage, forgiveness, and the simple, unbreakable truth. And that, my friends, is where we leave this incredible story. I am so grateful you stayed with us until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. I have to know, what part of this story hit you the hardest? Let me know everything you're thinking in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until then, take care.